12 December 1942, Kotelnikovo airfield, southern Russia. The Panzer IV engines turned over in the pre-dawn cold at Kotelnikovo, exhaust vapor rising white against the gray steppe as General Oberst Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army assembled for the relief operation that Field Marshal Erich von Manstein had designated Unternehmen Wintergewitter, Operation Winter Storm, a last attempt to break through Soviet lines and reach the encircled 6th Army trapped 100 kilometers north in the ruins of Stalingrad. The temperature stood at minus 22 degrees Celsius when the first units of the 6th Panzer Division rolled forward at 0545 hours, their tracks crushing the frozen earth into powder, followed by elements of the 23rd Panzer Division and the 17th Panzer Division, together forming a spearhead of approximately 230 tanks, including 42 Tiger I heavy tanks and a mix of Panzer IIIs and IVs, all moving in column formation along the narrow axis toward the Aksai River crossing. The tactical situation was desperate. General Friedrich Paulus and the 6th Army's 300,000 men had been encircled since 23 November when Soviet forces completed Operation Uranus, closing the ring around Stalingrad, and now the surrounded German forces subsisted on dwindling Luftwaffe air supply drops averaging 70 tons daily when 300 tons were required, their ammunition stocks falling, their horses already slaughtered for meat, their wounded dying in unheated basements, while temperatures plunged to minus 30. Manstein had assembled this relief force hastily from units scraped together across the southern front, and he knew the mathematics were unfavorable. The Soviets had positioned the 51st Army and 2nd Guards Army directly in his path, with approximately 400 tanks and strong artillery support, while further north, the 62nd Army held Stalingrad itself and would certainly shift reserves southward once the German intention became clear. The panzer columns moved through morning fog that clung to the ground like smoke, visibility less than 200 meters, the commanders standing in their cupolas, watching the white landscape pass, listening to the steady rumble of engines and the metallic clank of track links, radio traffic minimal to maintain operational security, though Soviet reconnaissance aircraft had certainly already spotted the concentration at Kotelnikovo. By 800 hours, the lead elements reached the first Soviet positions along the Aksai River, where hastily constructed earthworks and anti-tank ditches marked the outer defensive belt, and immediately the characteristic crack of Soviet 76.2 mm ZIS-3 anti-tank guns echoed across the frozen river valley, the 1st Panzer IV taking a direct hit that punched through its frontal armor and ignited the ammunition, the tank erupting in orange flame and black smoke that rose vertically in the still air. The German tanks deployed into assault formation, spreading across a 2-kilometer front, their commanders identifying targets through their optics, the muzzle flashes of anti-tank guns positioned behind snow berms, the rectangular shapes of dug-in T-34 tanks hauled down in defensive positions, the scattered forms of Soviet infantry in winter camouflage moving between positions. The Tigers advanced first, their 88mm KWK-36 guns engaging Soviet armor at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, the distinctive boom of the 88mm audible over the general din of battle, and within 30 minutes, 3 T-34s burned on the Soviet side of the river, their turrets blown off by catastrophic ammunition detonations. But the Soviet defenders held their positions and called for artillery support. At 0945 hours, the first salvo of 122mm howitzer fire landed among the German tanks, the shells creating black geysers of frozen earth and the shrapnel ringing against armor plate, one shell scoring a direct hit on a Panzer III that killed the commander instantly and wounded 2 crew members. And the German advance slowed as company commanders called for engineer support to bridge the anti-tank ditches. Soviet Ilyushin Il-2 Stormovik ground attack aircraft appeared at 1100 hours, coming in low from the northeast in flights of 4, their 23mm cannons firing and their RS-82 rockets streaking toward the German tank columns, and the accompanying German Flak 38 20mm anti-aircraft guns engaged them with streams of tracer fire that looked like red chains stretched across the sky, downing one Stormovik that cartwheeled into the steppe, trailing smoke and debris. By noon, the temperature had risen to -15°C, but the wind had picked up from the northeast at 20 km/h, creating a wind chill that penetrated every gap in winter clothing. And the German infantry riding on the tank decks dismounted to clear Soviet strongpoints, their MG-42 machine guns chattering in short bursts as they moved through the defensive positions, taking casualties from hidden Soviet troops armed with PPSH-41 submachine guns and anti-tank rifles. The first day's advance covered 12 kilometers before halted at a stronger Soviet defensive line, where the 51st Army had positioned a battalion of T-34s and multiple anti-tank batteries. And as darkness fell at 16:30 hours, the German forces consolidated their positions, the tank crews performing maintenance by flashlight while listening to the distant sound of artillery fire from Stalingrad itself, that continuous low rumble on the northern horizon that reminded them why they were fighting through the frozen hell of the Russian winter, knowing that 300,000 of their comrades waited for rescue that would have to cover 88 more kilometers through increasingly determined Soviet resistance. 17th December 1942, Verkhnekhunsky, southern Russia. The relief force had advanced 48 kilometers in 5 days when the 6th Panzer Division's lead elements reached the village of Verkhnekhunsky on the morning of 17th December, their tank strength reduced to approximately 150 operational vehicles after sustained combat with Soviet 51st Army units that had fought delaying actions along every defensive line between the Aksai and Myshkova Rivers, and now the temperature had dropped again to -28°C, with wind speeds gusting to 30 km/h that created whiteout conditions during frequent snow squalls across the steppe. The tactical situation had deteriorated significantly. Soviet intelligence had identified the German relief operation within 24 hours of its commencement, and Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky had responded by ordering the 2nd Guards Army under Lieutenant General Rodion Malinovsky to shift southward and establish a new defensive line along the Myshkova River, which lay only 35 kilometers from the Stalingrad pocket, but represented a formidable natural obstacle, reinforced by 3 divisions, including the 13th Tank Corps, with approximately 100 T-34 and T-70 tanks. Generaloberst Hoth had requested 6th Army break out to meet the relief force, but Hitler had explicitly forbidden any withdrawal from Stalingrad, and General Paulus had neither the fuel nor the strength to execute such an operation. His remaining tanks numbered fewer than 40 operational vehicles, his artillery possessed shells for perhaps 3 days of combat, and his troops were consuming horse meat and whatever could be salvaged from the city's ruins. The German armor concentrated for the assault on the Myshkova River line on the morning of 17th December, the Tigers and Panzer IVs forming up an attack formation, while Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers from Sturtzkampfgeschwader II flew overhead in preparation for close air support, their distinctive gull wings silhouetted against the overcast sky, but Soviet anti-aircraft batteries engaged them before they could deliver their ordnance, the 37mm automatic cannons creating patterns of black bursts that forced the Stukas to break formation. The river assault commenced at 0730 hours with a preliminary artillery barrage from German 105mm LFH-18 howitzers, the shells impacting along Soviet defensive positions in coordinated salvos that sent up clouds of snow and earth, but the frozen ground limited the effectiveness of high explosive rounds, and the Soviet defenders remained largely intact in their fortified positions. The first tanks entered the river valley at 07:15 hours, descending the southern slope where the terrain provided minimal cover, immediately drawing fire from concealed Soviet anti-tank positions on the northern bank, where 76.2mm guns had been positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. And within minutes, 2 Panzer IVs were burning in the valley, their crews bailing out and running for cover, while machine gun fire kicked up spurts of snow around their feet. A Tiger I advanced to the river's edge and engaged Soviet positions at point-blank range, its 88mm gun destroying an anti-tank gun with a direct hit. But Soviet infantry armed with Molotov cocktails infiltrated close enough to throw their improvised weapons onto the Tiger's engine deck, the burning gasoline seeping through the louvers and forcing the crew to abandon the vehicle before fire reached the ammunition storage. By 10 o'clock hours, the German attack had stalled completely, the armor unable to force a crossing against determined Soviet resistance, and Soviet artillery began to range in on German positions with increasing accuracy, the 122mm shells creating massive detonations that flipped lighter vehicles and killed exposed infantry, the concussion waves powerful enough to be felt inside closed tank turrets as pressure changes that made ears pop painfully. The tactical radio networks carried increasingly desperate transmissions as company commanders reported losses and requested support, and Hoth understood the mathematics of attrition were now working decisively against him. Every day of combat reduced his effective tank strength by 10 to 15% through mechanical failure, battle damage, and crew casualties, while Soviet reinforcements continued to arrive, including fresh units from the Stavka Reserve that brought the defenders' strength to over 200 tanks and 600 anti-tank guns concentrated between the Myshkova River and Stalingrad. The afternoon brought renewed German attacks supported by a company of Tigers that attempted to overwhelm Soviet positions through firepower and armor protection, and they succeeded in establishing a small bridgehead on the northern bank where engineers worked frantically to prepare a crossing site. But at 14:45 hours, a flight of Il-2 Sturmovix appeared and attacked the bridgehead with rockets and bombs, destroying the engineering equipment and forcing German forces to withdraw back across the river under covering fire from the Tigers, whose 88mm guns engaged the Soviet aircraft with high explosive shells. By evening, the German advance had progressed less than 3 kilometers, the forward positions now only 32 kilometers from Stalingrad's perimeter, close enough that officers with binoculars could see the flashes of artillery fire and smoke columns rising from the ruined city. But the cost had been severe: 23 tanks destroyed, 41 more damaged and requiring repair, and over 300 casualties among the Panzergrenadier infantry who had attempted to support the armored assault. In Stalingrad itself, the trapped 6th Army monitored the progress of the relief force through radio intercepts and aerial reconnaissance reports, and some units prepared for a possible breakout operation despite Hitler's prohibition, hoarding their remaining fuel and ammunition. But the distance remained too great and their strength too depleted. And as night fell on 17th December, with the temperature dropping to -31°C, the men in the Stalingrad pocket understood that their fate now depended on whether Hoth's battered panzer divisions could overcome the Soviet defenses in the next 48 hours before winter and attrition ground the relief operation to a final halt. 23rd December 1942, Myshkova River Line, southern Russia. The relief operation collapsed on 23rd December when Hoth received orders to halt the advance and redirect the 6th Panzer Division northwestward to counter a new Soviet offensive that had broken through the Italian 8th Army on the Middle Don River, threatening the entire southern front with envelopment and making the rescue of 6th Army tactically impossible, regardless of any further local success along the Myshkova. The decision reached 4th Panzer Army headquarters at 05:20 hours via encrypted radio transmission from Army Group Don, and Hoth understood immediately that Operation Winter Storm had failed, that the 290,000 men trapped in Stalingrad would not be relieved,
that they would face annihilation or surrender as Soviet forces methodically compressed the pocket through the winter months. The German tanks had reached to within 48 kilometers of the city during the night of 19-20 December, close enough that liaison officers proposed attempting a breakout link-up using Sixth Army's remaining mobile forces, but Paulus had requested Hitler's permission to execute such an operation and received only silence from Führer headquarters, the political leadership still refusing to authorize any withdrawal from the city that bore Stalin's name. And by 22nd December, the tactical window had closed as Soviet Second Guards Army reinforcements arrived in sufficient strength to halt any further German advance. The morning of 23rd December brought clear skies and bitter cold, minus 34 degrees Celsius with minimal wind, the kind of weather that created ice crystals in the air that glittered in the early sunlight and made every exposed metal surface painful to touch with bare skin. And the German tank crews began the process of disengaging from their forward positions, reversing their vehicles out of the defensive positions they had occupied during the previous night's Soviet counterattacks, and forming into march columns for the withdrawal southward. Soviet forces detected the German movement by 0700 hours and immediately launched coordinated attacks designed to prevent an orderly withdrawal. The 13th Tank Corps sending forward 2 brigades of T-34s, supported by infantry in American-supplied M3 half-tracks, and fierce fighting erupted along the entire front as German rearguard units fought to protect the retreating panzer divisions. A company of Tigers from Schwere Panzer Abteilung 503 positioned themselves on a low ridge overlooking the withdrawal route and engaged the pursuing Soviet armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters, their 88mm guns destroying 7 T-34s in the first 15 minutes of combat. But Soviet artillery soon found their position and began dropping 152mm shells around the ridge, the massive detonations creating craters 3 meters across and forcing the Tigers to displace to alternate positions. By mid-morning, the withdrawal had become a running battle stretching across 20 kilometers, the German columns moving south along the frozen roads, while Soviet aircraft harassed them with repeated ground attack runs. The IL-2 Sturmovix coming in at treetop level to strafe the vehicles with their 23mm cannons and launch rockets that created orange fireballs when they struck fuel trucks or ammunition carriers. The Luftwaffe attempted to provide air cover with Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters from Jagdgeschwader 52, and a series of dogfights developed over the withdrawal route at altitudes between 2,000 and 4,000 meters, the condensation trails of the maneuvering aircraft creating white spirals against the blue winter sky. But the German fighters were outnumbered and low on fuel, forced to break off and return to base after only 20 minutes of combat. In Stalingrad, the sound of the relief operation's failure reached Sixth Army through a combination of radio intercepts and the absence of expected artillery fire from the south, and the realization spread through the frozen positions and ruined buildings that no rescue would come, that they were abandoned to their fate in the city that had consumed them through 3 months of brutal urban combat and would now hold them through winter until death or surrender became inevitable. The withdrawal of 4th Panzer Army continued through 24 and 25 December, the columns fighting through Soviet blocking positions and losing vehicles to mechanical breakdown in the extreme cold, tracks freezing to their bogies during overnight halts and requiring hours of work with blowtorches to free them, engines refusing to start until crews heated the oil pans with open fires, and men suffering frostbite injuries when their winter clothing proved inadequate to protect them during the long hours of exposure during combat operations. By 28 December, the surviving elements of the relief force had reached defensive positions near Kotelnikovo, having lost approximately 100 tanks destroyed or abandoned during the operation, plus over 4,000 casualties among the panzer crews and supporting infantry, and the strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where even these battered divisions could not remain in position but had to redeploy northward to prevent a complete collapse of the southern front. The final radio transmissions between 6th Army and Army Group Don occurred on 30 December, when Paulus reported his forces had sufficient supplies for perhaps 3 more weeks before complete exhaustion, his request for permission to attempt a breakout rejected once more by direct order from Hitler, and the response from Manstein's headquarters acknowledged that no further relief operations were possible given the tactical situation and available forces. The winter nights grew longer and colder as January approached, temperatures falling below -40 degrees, and in Stalingrad the encircled army began the process of dying slowly, its perimeter compressed by relentless Soviet attacks, its supply situation hopeless as the Luftwaffe's airlift capacity fell below 50 tons daily due to aircraft losses and weather conditions, its hospitals filled with wounded who could not be evacuated and would not recover, and its soldiers understanding finally that they had been abandoned in the ruins of a city whose name would become synonymous with catastrophic military failure. And to the south, the men of 4th Panzer Army who had tried desperately to reach them now fought their own battles for survival against the winter and the Red Army's offensive operations. The memory of those 48 kilometers that separated success from failure burned into their consciousness as a testament to the ultimate futility of attempting to reverse through force of arms what strategy and circumstance had already decided.